Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining us on our webinar today, talking about MRL changes in the global marketplace. My name is Lisa Francioni. I work with the California Sustainable Wine Growing Alliance, and we're really happy to be co-hosting this webinar with the California Association of Winegrape Growers and Wine Institute. And the intention behind this webinar is really just to talk with our great panelists and experts in this area to really learn more about MRLs, really why they matter, why it's important for us as wine grape growers and winery employees to really understand them and understand how to actually track the changes to MRLs. So thank you again for joining us. We will be able to answer questions throughout the various presentations. So you're welcome to use the Q&A feature in Zoom and just type in your question as we're going, and the speakers are happy to take questions as we go. But then also, if you will have time at the end as well to have more conversation and time for questions. And just so you know, a quick overview of what we have for the next hour. We're going to start with Jamie Furman, the Senior Director of International Public Policy at Wine Institute, just to kind of set the stage for us a little bit, again, about how MRLs are really being addressed both within Wine Institute and just kind of in export markets in general. And then we have Caroline Stringer, who is the Trade Director for the California Fresh Fruit Association. And she's going to talk a little bit about how just kind of like broader ag and other crops, in addition to wine grapes and wine, are really being affected by MRLs and how they're handled in different export markets. And then we have Alini Olavide, sorry, close, Director of Global Access at Bryant Christie. And she's going to go into a little bit more of the specifics about really what are the different MRLs in different countries, how do we learn about those, and how do we really track that information so that we can use it in making decisions in both crop protection materials being used in the growing of wine grapes, then also just for wineries as well. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Jamie.
Thanks so much. So many of you may know Wine Institute is co-located in Washington, D.C. and in Sacramento. I cover international public policy issues from Washington, D.C. And MRLs are just one of the many international trade policy issues I monitor and on which I engage with the U.S. government regarding potential impacts on U.S. wine exports. Now, MRLs and crop protection residue policy are not always front of mind for a lot of wine companies. Fully understand that your day-to-day priorities are more likely focused on production, quality, your brand, and exporting those wines to markets around the world. But MRL policies increasingly shape whether those export markets remain open and under what conditions. Just be very clear, MRL changes don't just impact wine trade, but for wine, the issue is uniquely challenging because of the long production timeline. Decisions that are made today in the vineyard can affect wine that won't be bottled or exported for years. Unexpected MRL changes can affect wine that's in inventory, committed to export, or even while it's in transit. And these changes can result in testing delays, compliance costs, shipment rejections, and even loss of entire export markets. Now, I want to be clear, this can be overwhelming. In navigating all of these changes, what sometimes look conflicting from market to market, it can be complex. But I hope that through today's webinar, you'll learn some of the tools that we use here at Wine Institute and some that we hope that you will be using in your day-to-day business. We are seeing more frequent MRL changes and less alignment with what we would consider science-based international standards. And so this is an area really it's not just a technical issue, it's one of a strategic business risk decision. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me directly if you want to talk about any of these issues offline. And always, if you're exporting and you have a shipment that is flagged for possible non-compliance in an export market, reach out as soon as you have a concern. I've been here for 3 years. Before that, I was in the US government, also working on some of these issues. And it hasn't happened often while I've been here at Wine Institute, but it has happened. And we just want you to be prepared. So with that, I will turn it over to Caroline to get us started.
Okay, thank you. Hi everybody. Nice to be here. Thanks for the invitation. My name is Caroline Stringer. I'm the Director of Trade for the California Fresh Fruit Association. And my main job is to promote exports of stone fruit, so peaches, plums, and nectarines. But I also do a few other things, including I am the secretary for the Minor Crop Farmer Alliance. So I think that's how we got connected and asked, or I got asked to participate today is through my work there. So I first wanted to talk a little bit about the Minor Crop Farmer Alliance, and I think I haven't shared my screen yet. So let me do that first. I know Jorge wanted to see a presentation. Okay, you guys should be able to see the screen now. So the Minor Crop Farmer Alliance, our members are growers, shippers, packers, handlers, and processors of minor or specialty crops. Our main focus is to advocate for use of sound science in government pesticide policies. So Jamie talked a lot about some of the issues with backing away from using science to make decisions on pesticide MRLs. So that's really the main focus of our group. And then, we understand that our growers need access to crop protection tools that are safe for applicators, for workers, for the public, and for the environment, but they also need to do their job. And we work very closely with EPA and USDA on MRL concerns. The main markets, of course, are EU, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, but there are other markets where we have MRL issues as well. And the longer I work on these issues, the more markets we see MRL problems pop up. So it's not going away. I think the work is really important, and especially for the minor crop farmers, because we don't have as many tools as some of the row crops do. So in terms of specialty crops, when I say specialty crops or minor crops, I'm talking about fresh fruit, vegetables, tree nuts, horticulture, and wine. That's 20% of US ag cash receipts. So it's not insignificant. We generate $20 billion in export revenue as a group. And in 2025, minor crops or specialty crops were exported to 178 countries. So we're worldwide. But one important note is we need flexibility on meeting so that we can meet import requirements in as many export markets as possible. And that starts with how we are treating our orchards and vineyards and fields. I think more than ever, right now, what we see is so much is beyond our control when it comes to international trade that none of us can afford to lose an export market because of an MRL violation. So I think what I communicate to our growers, and I know the other trade associations that are members of the Minor Crop Farmer Alliance, is we don't want to have an issue. It's better to know ahead of time, better safe than sorry. I know it's not always easy to hear, but we really just don't want to have any bumps in the road when it comes to our export markets, just because we're all trying to find places for our fruit and our products, wine to go. At the end of the day, we want to keep the lights on and keep the businesses running for the next season. So we just want to make sure that we're doing everything we can to do that. And of course, in California, we have additional considerations. We have more restrictions here than in other producing regions in the US. I'm sure you guys are aware of that already. Not just when it comes to pesticides, when it comes to labor and other issues as well. We have a lack of nationally available tools. It takes longer for us to get EPA registered tools registered in California. Sometimes there's a lot of back and forth between California's Department of Pesticide Residues and our EPA versus the US EPA. So we are sometimes behind on what we can use. And what that means for our growers is they can't always use the best available tool or use them to their full extent. And I think that's really important from a grower's perspective. You always want to use the best available tool. And so it can be very frustrating for folks growing in California that, there might be something out there that will be great, when we finally get it approved here in California. So that's something that CFFA works on as well with our partners in the chemical registrants. So moving on, the effects on agriculture for an MRL violation. They asked, I don't want to scare people, but I kind of do want to scare people when it comes to MRL violations. And I think Alini can do a great job because she's got a lot of expertise in helping clients when there is a violation. But just overall, when you have a violation, it just means you exceed the tolerance. But they tend to have a domino effect in our export markets. First and foremost, we see a lack of trust. If the consumers are aware of it, there's a lack of trust in origin or maybe that brand, the retailer, the regulators in that export market start to have doubts about whether or not, we're a safe place to get produce or wine or what have you from. And our importers, our buyers also are wondering, is this going to be a supplier I can trust in the future? Almost always it leads to increased surveillance. So once they find a violation in a foreign market, they're going to increase their surveillance. They're going to start testing more. And, it's a numbers game. The more you test, the more you find if it's there. It can lead to loss of market access for the individual shipper. And in some cases, we're lucky if that's all that happens, because oftentimes there can be a loss of market access for the entire industry if they start testing more and they start finding that it's not just an individual shipper or an individual origin or individual supplier, that there's kind of a regional issue there. That can lead to loss of market access for the entire industry for a certain period of time. And then to add insult to injury, the importing country reports it to the FDA and our other trading partners. So now you've got US FDA coming asking, well, how did you get this MRL violation? And we may need to do our own investigation. The other trading partners are saying, well, we're aware of an MRL violation in this market, and now we're going to test in our market. So I don't want to exaggerate and scare people into never exporting, but it is something that you should take very seriously. So, it also leads to grower decisions based on considerations other than what is the best tool. And I think that's something that I always talk about when I'm talking to folks in DC, US government folks, certainly the folks that work for the chemical companies. They understand that the best thing to do is use the best tool, the best product. That's what we want. And when we don't have MRLs in our export markets, then we're forced to make decisions that aren't based on what the best protocol would be. And then, of course, there's just a lack of certainty in our export markets, which lead to, eventually reduced plantings. If you don't have markets to send your products to, then that impacts your bottom line. Profits are how we invest in our businesses and our people and our communities. It's also something that we communicate very often with our friends in Sacramento and our friends in Washington, D.C., that, we need these export markets and we need, fair access to them. So we've got to work as hard as we can to maintain that access. And then lastly, so notes from the field. Like I said, I work on stone fruit issues, and we are lucky in the sense that, we have growers who can dedicate fields or orchards or groves, vineyards, et cetera, to specific markets or the strictest market. And I know that's not necessarily the case for wine. I am a native of California, and I do my best to drink wine, but I think that's about as much as I really know about the industry. So, but I do know that's not always the case. You can store wine a lot longer than you can perishable fruit. So, from our standpoint, we will have growers dedicate fields to, typically it's Taiwan has the strictest MRLs for stone fruit. And so that's what they grow for. Alternatively, they will focus on export markets where they have the MRLs that they need already. So they'll say we're treating this orchard for X pest, and that means we can't ship it to this market. Period. End of story. Usually that's for smaller markets. And then either way, though, we need to keep our markets open and we have to keep MRLs in mind when we're making those treatment decisions, which is unfortunate. It would be nice if, if we're following the label requirements, that we meet the needs of all of our export markets and the domestic market. I think that would be the goal. And I think that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Caroline. And Alini, we'll turn it over to you.
All right, thank you. I'll start by sharing my screen. And see, I hope, can you all see it? Yes, all right. Yeah. Can you guys see my screen? Yep. Great. So good afternoon. I'm Aline Oliveira. I am the director for global access here at Bryan Christie. So Bryan Christie, we are a consulting firm. We have offices in Sacramento and in Seattle. We offer different services, but specifically to my job, I literally spend 100% of my time dealing with MRL issues, different MRL policies, monitoring MRL changes, working with different governments on harmonization and so forth. So I know MRLs are not too a topic that's too exciting to follow, but I can tell you that it is a huge headache when you do have a violation, unfortunately. So I've been asked to cover some of the basics on the challenges, the main challenges for MRLs in agricultural trade. I'll provide a quick overview of MRL policies in some key markets and how you can monitor those MRL changes, right? Like what can you do? Unfortunately, not all MRL policies are the same. So different markets may regulate MRLs differently. So that adds complexity to this issue. So first of all, highlighting the challenges. So to start, for wine specifically, MRLs are established on the raw agricultural commodity, in this case on wine grapes, right? So you have MRLs established on wine grapes, and then when you do export your wine, what happens is very few countries will establish MRLs specific to wine. There are some countries that do, but primarily what happens for enforcement purposes, that country will look at the wine grape MRL. Sometimes they only have a grape MRL that encompasses both table grapes and also wine grapes. And then they apply what is called like a processing factor, whether, sometimes that substance will either concentrate or dilute during the processing. So that adds more complexity into the MRL compliance world for wine. So I just want to point this out, so for you to keep this in mind as we go through this presentation. So first, why are MRLs a problem, right? Like you're growing, say in California, your growers, you're following the label, EPA approved, registered this label with so many applications. You followed your good agricultural practices, and then you can't export to another market. Why is that? And here is one example. So country Z, let's say United States, you followed a label and then you have an MRL of 0.5 ppm. And then you're exporting to these 5 different countries where one of them have an MRL at 0.1, another 1.5 harmonized with country Z, another 1 ppm is higher, and another one has a default of 0.01, and the other one doesn't have an MRL at all. So if you were going to look at this spread, you are only safe to export to countries B and C because all these other countries have MRLs established that are lower than what you have in your own country. The reasons why the MRL is different, I'm not going to get into the details here because apparently I only have 10 minutes, but there are many different reasons why MRLs are different. So you can have different use patterns in different countries, or sometimes some countries don't really grow wine grapes, so there's no reason for them to have, wine grape MRLs, and many other reasons, but there are scientific justifiable reasons why these MRLs differ. And then some of the problems of this MRL disharmonization is that, yes, countries do enforce, they are monitoring these products as they come in. And once you have an MRL restricted in a key market, just like Caroline just mentioned, like some of the growers, they have to have dedicated groves for a certain market, or if a certain year they have a certain pest pressure that they have to use that active ingredient that doesn't have an MRL in a key market, they might not export to that market that year. So you do have that toolbox restriction to the grower. And then sometimes you have a new chemistry that is new to market. Yay, great, it's going to address that concern that you have. But then that chemistry, that active ingredient doesn't have an MRL in your key market. So you have to wait another 2-3 years until those MRLs are established. So you have a delayed adoption of these new technologies. And then, of course, you have increased cost of compliance if you have to grow for the European Union, if you have to, I don't know, test every lot before you export. So all of this cost of compliance is increased due to this different harmonization of MRLs. And a worst case scenario, sometimes when they do find test and find a violation, sometimes you just have to have your product destroyed, and that's contributes to the overall food waste. In this case, wine, like no one wants to waste wine. So right now I'm going to provide, again, a very quick overview of some of your key markets of the different MRL policies. And I'm going to start with the European Union because I know it's an important market. So when you export to the European Union, the EU has a EU-wide MRL. So you don't have a German MRL or a Spanish MRL, so you just have to comply with the EU MRL. Recently, there has been some political moves to try to establish like some restrictions for the French or the Polish MRLs. Those are outliers. Those don't happen very often. But overall, the EU has the EU-wide MRL. They do apply what is called a default MRL, 0.01 parts per million. So when they don't have an MRL, they will apply that 0.01, which is the lowest level of determination. If you need an MRL in the European Union that you don't have tolerance, you can apply for an import tolerance. You can prepare a package, submit the residue data, and make that request. And then the European Food Safety Authority will review it, make a recommendation to the European Commission, and they potentially could establish that import MRL to facilitate trade. However, as we're going to see a little bit later, the EU has a very restrictive pesticide policy, and unfortunately is only getting worse. I'll cover that in a second. And the other market is Great Britain. So Great Britain, before Brexit, used to follow all of the EU MRLs. So after Brexit, the United Kingdom established its own system. And why we call it Great Britain is because it's England, Scotland, and Wales. Northern Ireland continued due to border issues. The Northern Ireland continues to follow EU MRLs. So for Great Britain MRLs, they started to establish their own MRLs. They adopted Codex MRLs. So for the past 4 years or so, the Great Britain MRLs have been different than the EU MRLs. But as you will see very soon as well, Great Britain, the UK and the EU are now negotiating an SPS agreement where Great Britain will once again start to adopt EU MRLs. So they're going to harmonize again with the EU MRLs, and that is unfortunate in some cases because Great Britain has actually established a whole lot of new MRLs that are not in place in the European Union right now. And briefly here for some of Canada, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, and China. So when we're looking at different markets, it's always important to know whether that market has its own MRL list. If they establish their own MRLs, it's not every market that establishes its own MRLs. But for those that do, it's important to know whether they do it or not, if they have a default MRL or not. So as you can see here, Canada, Taiwan, Canada, Japan, Korea, they have default MRLs. The Canada default MRL is a high one. Japan and Korea, it's low 0.01. Taiwan and China, they don't have a default MRL, so that is really a zero. If you have any detection, even if it's at the lower level of quantification, that will be considered a violation. In China, if you need an MRL in China, there is no way that you can request and import MRL. They don't have a system in place, but for these other markets here, they do have it, so you can request an MRL if you need it. Canada, Taiwan, particularly Taiwan, Japan, and Korea, they're actively monitoring for pesticide residues, very much so, and they have a very strict enforcement policy. You know, as Caroline also mentioned, sometimes you can lose access not only for the shipper, but for the entire industry, and they may escalate to test 100% of all the product that's coming in. So if you do have a violation, those consequences can be very, very difficult to overcome. And here are just some of the recent changes that are going on. As I mentioned, the EU and UK, they are negotiating an SPS agreement. So it is expected by mid-2027, all of the UK MRLs will be harmonized with EU MRLs once again. However, that agreement is not final yet, no pen to paper yet, but it is expected by next summer that's going to be the case. So just keep an eye out for that. Japan, they are currently reviewing all of their active ingredients, all of their pesticides that have been approved. So what's happening is that because of that, you might see a lot of MRL changes in Japan. It's not really targeted to restrict MRLs, but they're just doing an overall review. So if data for wine grapes are not submitted, for instance, you might lose an MRL because of this review. But it's not really, the objective is not to restrict. It's just an overall review of their pesticides that are going on. And this is a multi-year project. And then the good news on the US side is that the United States has been negotiating multiple bilateral agreements, the so-called agreements of reciprocal trade. And for some of these agreements, in the language, they have that for imported products, for US products, that country will adopt or will accept the US MRL. And that is very good news. So I only listed a few here, which includes Taiwan. But keep in mind that these agreements are not in effect yet. But when they do become effective, that's going to be very helpful for trade. So do keep an eye out on these reciprocal agreements that are the current administration is negotiating. Now about the European Union. So the European Union is the region, I think the market that has the most restrictive pesticide policy. So it started, you know, before with the Green Deal, with Farm to Fork, and the objective was to really restrict all pesticide use within the European Union, and then find ways to restrict the market for imported products as well. At that time, there wasn't any specific proposals. It was more a broader proposal, but very recently, at the end of 2025 in December, European Union tabled a proposal that's called the Food and Feed Safety Package. It's also known as Omnibus. And in that proposal, there are many great things, actually, you know, for EU growers. But there are a few of the proposals in that package that are really of concern. Two of them that are really important for the wine industry. One of them is that the EU will not establish or will not keep EU MRLs for substances that are no longer approved for use in the European Union. So if EU farmers, EU growers cannot use that active ingredient, they're going to restrict the MRL with the objective that their competitors abroad in foreign markets will not use that active ingredient and export to the European Union. So this is a concern. Of course, not all growing regions have the same pest pressures, you know, have the same crop protection needs. So that could be very bad for some growers because they will further restrict their toolbox. And the other one, and this is of particular interest to wine, as Jamie mentioned as well during her initial remarks, you're growing, you're applying today, let's say this season on your vineyard. You don't know when the final product is going to be exported to its destination market. Sometimes it can be a few years. So between application and exports, the MRL may change. So usually when an MRL change, you have a transition time that's only of 6 months. And obviously that's not enough to cover the wine needs. So we've been working with the US government and also even the European Commission to include a language, what we call the channels of trade. Basically what that means is that the MRL at time of application would be applicable, would apply to products with a long shelf life. So if the European Union includes that language whenever there is an MRL change, that's going to be very positive. However, the current proposal would account for the date that the product, that the wine is imported and not when it's produced. So, or when the active ingredient was applied. So that is a huge concern because then, you would lose the benefit of these channels of trade provision. So those are two key issues that are of particular interest to the wine industry. And I know Jamie has been following this closely as well. And finally, quick review here. I took a look at the list of active ingredients that are relevant for the California winegrape growers. And so you have some active ingredients that are approved in the European Union for use, and they still have MRLs. So those are those 31s on your left-hand side. I hope my presentation doesn't reflect the opposite way there. And then you have some approved MRLs, approved substances with no MRLs. Those you have 9 active ingredients. And then you have those that are not approved, but some still have MRLs and some don't. So I would call attention to those where you still have MRLs, and especially the third column where the substance is no longer approved, but it still have an MRL. I would say that all of those are at risk of losing the MRL, particularly if the omnibus is implemented as it has been proposed. So it is likely and possible, I cannot tell you how soon because all of this is a proposal, is still under negotiations, but it is possible that all of those MRLs could be at risk of being withdrawn in the European Union. This presentation will be available to you, so I think you just reach out to the webinar organizers and they can share that with you. And finally, how can you manage all these MRL changes, right? So as I mentioned before, it's really important for you to know what are the MRLs of your export markets. And it's good to know whether your export market actually has their domestic MRLs. Do they test? Do they enforce? What's the enforcement policy? If there is an issue, engage with the US government so they can provide comments and try to keep or pursue an MRL on the industry's behalf. And in that case, sometimes some industries will hire consultants, such as BCI. We work with other groups as well, where we can actively seek missing MRLs, the MRLs that are needed in the market that you're working. Some of the tools that you have available to you, you have the MRL database. So this database, you can have free access to the currently established MRLs in the United States and in key markets around the world. So I did include a link here. You do have to create an account. You do have to log in and sign in, but the access to the current MRLs is free. It is an access that is subsidized by USDA and EPA as well. So you should have access to this database. I highly recommend that you become familiar with it. The second tool that is also available to you, so under the USDA initiative Assisting Specialty Crop Exports, they are currently preparing these MRL quick reference sheets So you have an image here of this is a spreadsheet where you have your active ingredients, you have the trade name, the class of product, right? What kind of a pesticide it is, the registrant, and then whether that active ingredient is monitored in certain countries. And then, of course, the MRLs established in the US, Codex, and then 10 priority markets. So the MRLs are there, easy for you to compare. These QRS, they're updated twice per year, once in January and once in July. So the next update will be next month. So you can come here to this link on the quick reference sheets, and then you can come and download the Winegrape QRS. If you have other commodities that you work with, there are 60 commodities in which USDA is preparing these sheets for. So you can find this information all on this website. So that's a way for you to know what the MRLs are. If you have any issues, as Jamie mentioned in the beginning on her remarks, if you have any violations, any concerns, I do suggest you reach out to Jamie and let her know of any concerns that you may have. There are some other initiatives going on as well through USDA. USDA is very active. The Foreign Agricultural Service, FAS, is very active on this MRL space around the world. So there are multiple initiatives going on right now with the objective to harmonize MRLs and really try to facilitate trade. But this is one of those technical issues that you have different methodologies, analysis. So we've been engaging and working multiple countries with this. We have made some progress, but it's a continuous work that we've been doing. So with that is, I apologize. I know it's a lot of material to cover in such a short time, but I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Great. Thank you so much. That was so helpful. Let's see, it looks like we do have a question. Oh, it must have been asked right before you shared the database. Is there somewhere to find proposed and, oh, actually, no, proposed and pending MRLs? So I know there's information about existing ones.
So for proposed and pending MRLs, that information is available in Food Chain ID MRL database as well, but that is a subscription based. So you would have to pay extra to have access, but it is there. So you could inquire with them to see the cost of having access to it.
Great, thank you. And so one of the questions I would love for either of you, Alini or Caroline, to talk a little bit about is how enforcement actually works, and then what happens if there is a violation. Can you talk a little bit about that, either one of you?
Sure. I mean,
You start. You start, I'll go after.
Well, I mean, there are some countries that, annually will issue a list of what chemicals they're going to be testing for on what products and how often. That's pretty transparent. That's a lot easier for the trade associations once they're made aware by their US government contacts. They can send it straight out to everybody and say, hey, look, this is what Taiwan is saying they're going to be testing for, or Japan or Korea. Alini is the EU expert, and we luckily don't ship to the EU. So sorry, I don't mean to brag, but another lifetime ago, I worked for the almond industry, and I think I had my fill of EU issues. So I did my time, but the EU just tests for everything all the time, always, and they find new ways to test anyway. New unverified methods of testing things sometimes. They're really creative. They certainly have a lust for new and inventive ways to disrupt trade. But that's one way. And I think that that they want to be methodical. They're not trying to. There are many markets where they're not really trying to catch you off guard. They're just really trying to implement public health policies. So that's one way to do it. Our government does it too.
Yes.
So we don't want to, we certainly don't want to disparage any country and say you can't protect the health of the people that live in your country. But so that's typically what'll happen is, something will arrive and it will be randomly selected to be tested. And randomly means different things to different people in different countries. Sometimes it's based on past performance from the market. Sometimes it's based on past performance of the shipper or the importer. If think about it from like, I have one niece and one nephew, and only one of them do I find candy wrappers, in his room. So that's the one, if I'm looking for missing candy, I'm going to go to his room first. And governments are not different. Food safety officials are not different. If they see that there's a pattern, they're going to focus their energies where that pattern is. That's kind of the enforcement side. And then, Alini, I think you probably have a lot more than just jokes to add to that about how that works. And then we
Yeah.
can talk about violations. Like, we'll have to drink some wine and talk about violations.
Yeah. So for the enforcement, so every country will have their own enforcement policy as well, right? So as Caroline well mentioned, like no one's trying to play catch up. They're just doing randomized. Usually they have a risk-based randomized system to try to test, 1% of everything that comes in, or certain commodities that are more prone to have violations, or maybe some countries that they most of the time have violations, so they will focus on those as well. So a lot of countries have active monitoring lists, and some countries will publish those lists. So for Japan, Korea, Taiwan, European Union, like many Canada, Australia, like those lists are public. The bad news is their list has 800 active ingredients. So basically they're looking at everything, right? So you can just assume that they are testing against everything that's out there. I think what is different is what happens if there is a violation, right? So if there is a violation, that's where a difference in different markets. In Asia, they tend to be very strict. If you have a violation, so then sometimes you increase that testing to everything that comes in, it's going to be 50% from that exporter. And then if you have a second violation, then it's 100% until you have like 5 shipments that's clear. If you continue to have violations, you might be banned from the market for however many years, not years, but some time that you can work it out. And sometimes if you have a violation as well, your product might be destroyed. Or sometimes, depending on the product, wine might be the case because you have a long shelf life. You might be able to reroute it to another market where that MRL is compliant. But all of this has a cost, right? For example, I was looking, Caroline mentioned about the monitoring list. So the European Union, they do publish the results of their monitoring. So out of one specific targeted monitoring that the EU had in 2024, they tested 160 samples of wine, of which multiple were found to have residues within the MRL. It was not a violation, but they did find residues. And 2 instances of European wine, it wasn't imported wine, of European wine, they were found to be in violation, and those batches were recalled from the market and destroyed. So they are monitoring and they are taking action against it.
And you talked about kind of what happens in the winemaking process that changes what they're testing for. Can you talk a little bit more about that, like how they're testing a finished product, but they're looking at MRLs that are
Right.
for materials applied to grapes?
Yeah. So I get this question all the time. They're like, oh, my product is processed. It's not fresh. So I'm good. And I'm like, not really. So sometimes you are right. Like it is true that they are looking less at processed products than they are looking at fresh products. That is overall, in a broad generic statement, that is true. But that does not mean that they're not looking at processed products like raisins or wine or even hops used in beer, so they do test. And when they do test, the MRLs, when they're established in the, for raisins, it would be on table grapes, and then raisins, it's processed, or wine is processed from wine grapes. So there is something that's called a processing factor. So the pesticides, they act differently depending on the process. So let's say if you ferment or if you heat or if you filter, sometimes that active ingredient will concentrate and sometimes will dilute. So that's why you have different processing factors, which further complicate for wine, because that number that you see on those charts is not necessarily what's applied on wine. So, and then what processing factor is applied? Where can you find that information? You really can't. Like, it's really hard. So sometimes you have to find that information from the registrant that developed that product because they know how that active ingredient will act. And the European Union, they do have a database of processing factors that it's indicative. So it's not a binding, but it's indicative. So at least we can have an idea of the behavior of that active ingredient if it tends to concentrate or dilute. So I know that there are different processing factors for red wine, for white wine, and for sparkling wine sometimes for the same active ingredient. So I must say that wine MRLs is as complex as it gets.
Mm. Jamie, do you want to add to that?
Thanks. Yeah, I just want to flag that we're in a very politically charged international trade environment, which could mean that wine wasn't looked at closely before, but as a product of the United States could find that it has renewed scrutiny by certain parts of the world, just because they can. So that's something we want to be sensitive to.
Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering how you would like advise growers, especially about what you were just talking about, Alini, of are they really just looking at the MRL numbers and then making sure that, as they're growing, they're at least looking at what's the limit today, like in the year that they're growing for?
Yeah, that's a tricky one, but you definitely like if you see that you don't have an MRL, and this again, it varies, but let's say most of your production is destined to the European Union, and if you see that there is no MRL in the EU, that's already a flag that you may want to consult with your PCA, whether you should be applying that active ingredient, or if there is an alternative that you can do so you don't have residues when you're shipping to that market.
Yeah. Caroline, do you have anything to add to that of like how you advise growers when these things are changing so
Yeah,
frequently?
I don't know, and I don't know how this works with wine, but I'm assuming it's very similar that, you guys should be doing your own surveillance, especially if you have wine that is I might use the wrong terminology, but stored, right? Like I just drove, up and down the 99 yesterday and the day before. There's lots of grapes growing, and you can even see some wine being made. So it's being stored. It's you know what it's going to test when you should know what residues are there. And you have the capability to do that. I think a lot of times in our members, and this was almonds and stone fruit and table grapes as well, there's kind of a fear of like, well, I don't want it on paper because then it's proof that I know. But I would say that more information is better than less information. And that way, how the residues decline over time. Or if, as Alini was referring to, there's a dissolution, it's minimizes or becomes more concentrated. You would have that information over seasons if you are taking samples and doing your own residue testing. I would highly, highly encourage that be done.
Great. We have another question. When Omnibus goes into effect, not approved compounds with MRLs will default to 0.01 question. Is that correct?
So it's not going to be automatic, but the idea is that for not approved compounds, the MRLs will go away. And we're I mean, they could go to 0.01 or lower sometimes, as we've seen with some active ingredients. They will not default to Codex.
Mm.
And in terms of grace period, again, like I said, it's usually a 6 months transition time. And we've been working really hard with the US government and the European Commission to include that channels of trade that I briefly mentioned, into some of these MRL changes, at least to protect the things that are happening right now, to create a little bit of what we call regulatory certainty moving forward to these MRLs when they do change. But if the omnibus is implemented, let's say today, it's not tomorrow that all these MRLs will go away. Okay, so there is a process that needs to happen, and that might take a year, it might take 2 years, but it's just in the case of wine because it's not, if you were a fresh product, I think I would be like, yeah, it's fine, you know, like it will go away, but you're gonna know in advance. But for wine, it's really hard to know. So it might take a couple of years for the MRLs to go away, but they're not going to go away all at once. And yes, they're likely to go to default or lower.
Right. We have another question. Is there a list of approved labs to test for MRLs?
I think that depends on the market. Because when you test for MRLs, there is the so-called the methods of analysis. So just a simple example, right? The methods of analysis for banana in the EU, they might include the peel and some others might not include the peel. So I think you should check with the export market to see. I know some folks prefer certain labs when they ship to the EU, and then there are some Korean accredited labs in the United States if you ship to Korea. So it really depends on the market. And the labs will usually tell you what are the methods. You just tell them the market that you export and they will let you know.
Great.
Yeah, I think you just want anything with like ISO rating.
Definitely.
It's not your high school neighbor kid testing in his room, but you know, there are definitely labs that your trade association probably already works with that can do some analysis, and those guys, they're you know, they're in business to keep you guys in business. And what's nice about a lot of those services is that you could be testing for whatever, maybe 10 or 15 of the most commonly used compounds. But you know, when I was at the almond board, we had one of the labs that we worked with actually called me and said, hey, I noticed a spike in this. We were testing for X, but I noticed this spike, and that typically means that you've got residues for this other group, you know, which would be a different test. Do you want me to run it? You know, so just kind of like the more information you have, the better, and the better the lab and the better the lab people, the more they know, you know, they understand international MRLs and the implications as well. So it's nice to know when you have all these people who have your back. It can be really scary, but that's what your trade associations are for. And Jamie didn't ask me to say this, and Lisa didn't either, but I just want to encourage everybody, you know, when they ask you a weird question at like 3 in the morning, like, hey, do you use this compound, or how often do you use it? It's probably because they're trying to figure out, should I get an MRL in this market, or, you know, are we going to see more pest pressure? And so we might see more residues of this certain insecticide. So just, you know, provide the information, because I guarantee you they're asking for a really good reason and they're trying to protect the industry for something downstream.
Another question, are lower than default, so 0.01 MRLs common? Are they trending? Are they becoming more common in the future?
So no, it's not trending right now, but there has been a discussion again, as Caroline mentioned before, the EU is very creative. So there has been conversations, and even sometimes the EU has been noting like our labs, the equipment is becoming more precise. So for some MRLs, they have established 0.0001, 0005. So when I say default or lower is because yes, there is a push by certain member states, non-technical, more of a political push to try to get the MRLs, it's called the ALATA, as low as reasonable, I forgot it. Sorry, but it's the
Reasonably
Alara,
achieved.
the reasonably
Reasonably
achieved.
achieved.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Caroline. Yeah, so the Alara principle. So
Hmm.
is it possible in the future in the European Union? It could be possible, but most countries are not bothering to go below 0.01. But I only mentioned that calling attention to the EU, considering the language, the political pressure that it's around the omnibus.
Mhm. And you talked about the transition time once there are MRL changes being 6 months. Is that for other export markets too, or is that just the EU?
So in general, whenever an MRL changes, it is 6 months. For instance, in the EU, it's not binding. It's not legally binding. It doesn't have to always be 6 months. In most countries, even WTO, they encourage 6 months. But again, they're thinking with a fresh product in their
Mhm.
mind. So they say, oh, 6 months, that should be enough. But for most markets is 6 months. Some markets they allow a year, sometimes a year and a half, but 6 months is it's what's usual.
Yeah. And so, Eleni, do you expect that the EU proposals will be implemented then, the that you talked about?
So, like I mentioned, the omnibus includes a lot of things, and it includes a lot of good things, good changes, actually. Like fast track for biopesticides, includes, other good things. Um, and because of that, I do think, and since it's a package, you can't just move one thing and not the other. So I do think it will move forward. But unfortunately, I just had a call today at 6 a.m. with folks in Brussels where they do think that the MRL part that we are concerned will be capped. It has been capped in multiple versions of this proposal so far. Actually, some European members wants just to make it even worse, even more restrictive. So unfortunately, I do think this will move forward, but there is a lot of pressure from many countries around the world at the WTO in Brussels trying to see if they can exclude that MRL part. So we will see how it goes. Right now, it's not a technical anymore. It's really political where the European Union wants to go. So far, it is there in the current text still.
Yeah. Great. I don't know if there's any other questions from our participants. Doesn't. Oh, is a vision for ag and food and omnibus the same thing?
Great question. Yes and no. So the Vision for Agriculture and Food is the European strategy piece compared to the Green Deal, right? So the Farm to Fork is to the Green Deal what the Omnibus is to the Vision for Agriculture. So every 5 years, whenever you have a new commission, they publish that vision document, their strategy document that just say, here's where we want to go. And then the farm to fork proposals and the omnibus proposal, think of it as being the legislative text that carries that vision forward. So yes, the omnibus reflects the vision, but they're not necessarily the same thing. You're going to have many other packages not related to pesticides that also carry forward what the vision for ag has. You have the NGTs, right? Gene editing or other things that are also in the vision that are separate packages moving forward.
Great. Well, thank you both so much. Really appreciate this. I hope everyone walked away with some great new information. We will be sharing the recording and including links to the database, but please follow up with any questions that you still may have. And just thank you again and have a great day.
Thank you.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.
Bye.